In the calculus of naval warfare, it is the giants that seize the imagination. The immense battleships with their colossal guns and the sprawling aircraft carriers, floating cities that project power across entire oceans. But beneath these titans, there has always been a class of warship built for a different purpose. They are the wolves of the sea, designed for speed, aggression, and lethality. In the Imperial Japanese Navy of World War II, the pinnacle of this predatory design was the Kagerō-class destroyer. And among these 19 elite vessels, one would bear witness to almost the entire Pacific War, from the first triumphant shots to the final, desperate gasp. This is the story of the Japanese destroyer Isokaze. The name Isokaze translates to wind on the beach, a deceptively gentle name for a ship that was anything but. Laid down in November 1938 at the Sasebo Naval Arsenal, Isokaze was the 12th ship in a class that naval historians and designers of the era considered to be, in many ways, perfect. Japan had been constrained by naval treaties for years, forcing its designers to innovate, to squeeze the absolute maximum combat potential out of every ton of displacement. The Kagerō-class was the result of this forced evolution. They were fast, capable of speeds exceeding 35 knots, or about 40 miles per hour, 65 kilometers per hour. They were armed with 6 5-inch, 127mm guns in 3 twin turrets, a formidable anti-surface armament that outgunned many of their allied counterparts. But their true lethality, the weapon that made them the most feared destroyers on the planet in 1941, was hidden in their torpedo tubes. Nestled amidships were 2 quadruple launchers, housing 8 of the infamous Type 93 torpedoes. The Allies would later nickname it the Long Lance, and for good reason. This was a weapon of staggering power. It was oxygen-propelled, which meant it left almost no visible wake, making it incredibly difficult to spot. It was astonishingly fast, and its range was immense, capable of striking targets from over 20 miles, 32 kilometers away. To put that in perspective, the standard American destroyer torpedo of the time, the Mark 15, had a maximum range of less than 9 miles, 15 kilometers. The Long Lance carried a warhead weighing over 1,000 pounds, 490 kilograms, enough to cripple or sink even a heavy cruiser with a single hit. The Kagerō-class destroyers were essentially delivery systems for this revolutionary weapon, wolf packs ready to be unleashed. When Isokaze was commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy on November 30, 1940, she and her sister ships represented the sharpest tip of Japan's naval spear. She was assigned to Destroyer Division 17, which in turn was attached to the 1st Carrier Striking Force, the legendary Kido Butai. Isokaze would serve as a bodyguard to giants, and her first mission would change the world. In late 1941, Isokaze sailed with the Kido Butai as it made its clandestine journey across the North Pacific. Her role, along with the other destroyers, was crucial: to screen the precious aircraft carriers from any potential submarine or surface threat. Their mission was to ensure that the carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, could launch their air wings without interference. On the morning of December 7, 1941, they did just that. While aircraft descended upon Pearl Harbor, Isokaze patrolled the churning seas, her crew standing at battle stations, listening to the distant echoes of a war they had just started. The mission was a stunning tactical success, and for the crew of the Isokaze, it was the beginning of what seemed like an unstoppable tide of victory. In the months that followed, Isokaze was constantly in action. In January 1942, she escorted the carriers as they supported the invasion of Rabaul in New Britain. In February, she was part of the force that launched the devastating air raid on Darwin, Australia. In April, she steamed into the Indian Ocean, part of a powerful flotilla that hunted the British Eastern Fleet, sinking the carrier Hermes and several other warships. For the men aboard Isokaze, the first 6 months of the war were a whirlwind of success. They were part of the most powerful naval force on Earth, and it seemed no one could stand against them. They were the proud escorts of an invincible fleet. But in the vastness of the Pacific, fortune is a fickle companion, and the balance of the war was about to be decided in a single, cataclysmic battle. In early June 1942, Isokaze once again sailed as an escort for Admiral Nagumo's 4 lead carriers, this time with the objective of seizing Midway Atoll and destroying the American Pacific Fleet. The mood was confident. After all, why shouldn't it be? But this time the Americans knew they were coming. Codebreakers had unraveled the Japanese plan, and the U.S. Navy was waiting in ambush. On the morning of June 4th, the battle began. From Isokaze's bridge, her crew would have watched as Japanese planes roared off the carrier decks to strike Midway. And then they would have watched as American planes began to appear, first in small, uncoordinated groups, then in swarms. Torpedo bombers came in low, bravely flying into a wall of anti-aircraft fire from ships like Isokaze. The destroyers' guns blazed, joining a curtain of steel that tore the American squadrons apart. But they kept coming, and then, in the space of 5 minutes, everything changed. While the Japanese combat air patrol was drawn down low to deal with the torpedo bombers, American dive bombers appeared high above, unopposed. They plunged down on the Japanese carriers, whose decks were packed with refueling and rearming aircraft. Isokaze's crew could only watch in horror as 3 of the 4 carriers they were sworn to protect, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were transformed into burning wrecks. Isokaze was ordered to assist the stricken Soryu. But the damage was too great. The fires were uncontrollable. As she circled the dying carrier, Isokaze fired her guns at an American submarine, the Nautilus, that was attempting to finish Soryu off. Later, she was given the heartbreaking task of picking up survivors before 2 of her own torpedoes were fired into Soryu's hull to scuttle her. A mercy killing for a proud warship. The Battle of Midway was a catastrophe for Japan. The Kido Butai was shattered, and the initiative in the Pacific had been lost. For Isokaze, the nature of the war had fundamentally changed. The era of easy victories was over. The focus of the war now shifted south to the sweltering jungles and treacherous waters of the Solomon Islands. Here, the fighting would be a brutal, grinding war of attrition. Isokaze participated in the major carrier clashes of the campaign, including the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August and the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942. At Santa Cruz, she once again witnessed the fury of carrier warfare, escorting the carrier Zuiho and engaging American warships. Though the Japanese won a tactical victory, sinking the carrier Hornet, their own losses in veteran pilots were irreplaceable. Following these battles, Isokaze's duties changed. She became part of the infamous Tokyo Express, the near-nightly runs by Japanese destroyers to ferry troops and supplies to the starving garrisons on Guadalcanal. This was dangerous, exhausting work. By day, the destroyers would hide from American aircraft. By night, they would dash down the Slot, the narrow channel running through the Solomon Islands, drop off their cargo, and race back before sunrise. The ever-present threat was American aircraft from Henderson Field and, increasingly, technologically superior American naval forces. Isokaze performed these duties for months, a testament to the endurance of her machinery and her crew. In early 1943, she helped cover the successful evacuation of the remaining Japanese troops from Guadalcanal, a rare bright spot in a campaign of defeat. But the constant operations took their toll. On March 2nd, while escorting a troop convoy, Isokaze was damaged by a mine laid by an American aircraft near Kavieng, requiring her to return to Japan for extensive repairs. The war of attrition was taking its toll not just on men, but on the irreplaceable ships themselves. By the time Isokaze returned to the fleet in mid-1943, the strategic situation had worsened considerably. The Americans were on the offensive across the Pacific. For the next year, Isokaze was engaged in escort duties, protecting convoys and larger warships as they moved between the major naval bases of Truk, Palau, and Japan. This was vital, but unglamorous work. The days of decisive fleet actions seemed to be over, replaced by a constant struggle against American submarines and aircraft that were strangling Japan's supply lines. But in October 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy would gamble everything on one last monumental battle. The Americans were invading the Philippines, and Japan initiated a complex, multi-pronged plan called Shogo 1 to repulse them. Isokaze was assigned to Admiral Takeo Kurida's powerful center force, the most formidable surface fleet Japan could still muster, which included the super-battleships Yamato and Musashi. Isokaze's role was once again to screen these behemoths. On October 24th, as Kurita's force sailed through the Sibuyan Sea, they came under relentless attack from hundreds of American carrier aircraft, the sky filled with explosions and streaking tracers. For the crew of Isokaze, it was a terrifying spectacle. They dodged bombs and strafing runs, their anti-aircraft guns firing until the barrels glowed red. They watched in awe and horror as their sister ship, the super-battleship Musashi, absorbed an incredible 19 torpedoes and 17 bomb hits before finally capsizing and sinking. The center force was battered, but it pressed on. The next day, on October 25th, through a combination of luck and American mistakes, Kurita's force emerged off the coast of the island of Samar and stumbled directly into a tiny group of American escort carriers and their screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts. This was Taffy 3. What followed was one of the most remarkable and mismatched naval actions in history. The mighty Japanese fleet, including Yamato, bore down on what should have been easy prey. Isokaze charged forward with the other destroyers, her guns blazing at the American ships. The American destroyers, in an act of incredible bravery, turned to face the Japanese battleships, launching torpedoes and laying smoke to protect their vulnerable jeep carriers. The battle off Samar was a chaotic, swirling melee. Isokaze participated in the attack, firing her guns and likely launching her feared long-lance torpedoes into the fray. The Japanese force sank one escort carrier and several of the screening destroyers. But the fierce American resistance, combined with constant air attacks and Admiral Kurita's own confusion and exhaustion, caused the Japanese to break off the attack just when victory seemed within their grasp. During the withdrawal, Isokaze was tasked with rescuing 527 survivors from the sinking heavy cruiser Chikuma, her decks crowded with men who had lost their own ship. Isokaze had survived yet another major battle, but the Battle of Leyte Gulf was a death blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. By the spring of 1945, Japan was on the verge of collapse. American B-29 bombers were incinerating its cities. Its merchant fleet was annihilated, and its navy was mostly at the bottom of the sea or trapped in port for lack of fuel. But there was one last symbol of Japan's martial pride still afloat: the super-battleship Yamato. In a final, desperate act of defiance, Imperial General Headquarters conceived Operation Tango. Yamato, along with a light cruiser and 8 destroyers, including the veteran Isokaze, was to sail for Okinawa, where American forces had just landed. Their mission was insane. They had no air cover and barely enough fuel for a one-way trip. The plan was for Yamato to fight its way to the coast, beach itself, and act as an unsinkable gun battery, its crew fighting to the last man as infantry. It was not a military operation, it was a ritual sacrifice. On April 6, 1945, Isokaze and the other escorts formed a protective ring around Yamato as the small fleet sailed from Japan. The crews knew what this mission was. There was no pretense of victory or survival. The next day, April 7th, the inevitable happened. American reconnaissance planes spotted the force, and the U.S. Navy launched a massive airstrike, nearly 400 aircraft from the carriers of Task Force 58. The sky turned black with American planes. The attack was swift, brutal, and overwhelming. Waves of dive bombers and torpedo bombers descended on the Japanese ships. Yamato, the main target, fought back with every gun she had, but she was a giant being swarmed by hornets. The escorts did what they could, maneuvering violently and putting up a screen of anti-aircraft fire, but it was hopeless. During this maelstrom, a bomb scored a near miss on Isokaze. The resulting explosion tore a large hole in her port side, flooding her engine and boiler rooms. Her rudder was jammed, and she went dead in the water, helpless. As the battle raged around her, Isokaze's crew fought to control the flooding and get the ship moving again, but the damage was too severe. She was powerless, adrift in a sea of fire and death. She could only watch as Yamato, after absorbing a dozen bombs and at least 7 torpedoes, was ripped apart by a cataclysmic magazine explosion that sent a mushroom cloud thousands of feet into the air. The symbol of the Japanese Navy was gone. With the battle over, the surviving Japanese ships began to assess the damage. Isokaze was still afloat, but she was a wreck, unable to move or steer. Her crew had suffered 20 killed and 54 wounded. The commander of the flotilla knew that the crippled destroyer could not be saved and could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. The order was given to abandon ship. The destroyer Yukikaze, herself a famously lucky ship that would survive the entire war, came alongside to take off Isokaze's surviving crew, including her commander. Once the transfer was complete, Yukikaze moved off and finished the job her sister ship's crew had fought so hard to prevent. She opened fire with her own guns, pumping shells into the helpless hull of the Isokaze. The wind on the beach finally slipped beneath the waves, 150 miles, 240 kilometers, southwest of Nagasaki. The story of the destroyer Isokaze is the story of the Imperial Japanese Navy in World War II. She was born of brilliant design and innovation, a vessel that was, for a time, the best in the world. She was present for the stunning opening victories and was a key player in the epic carrier battles that defined the war. She endured the brutal grind of a war of attrition and fought with distinction in the final chaotic clashes of the great battle fleets. And in the end, she was sacrificed in a futile gesture of defiance, her end as tragic and violent as the empire she served. From Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, Isokaze was there. A tough, reliable, and deadly warship that saw it all. A true legend of the sea. The history of warfare is filled with vessels like the Isokaze, ships whose incredible stories are often overshadowed by the larger narrative. But their tales of endurance, bravery, and technological innovation are just as compelling. If you find these deep dives into the lives of legendary machines as fascinating as we do, make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss our next investigation. We believe every rivet and every journey has a story worth telling. And that brings us to our next mission briefing, which comes from you. What piece of military history, legendary war machine, or forgotten battle do you think needs to be brought into the light? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. We read every single one, and your idea might just become our next featured story. Thank you for joining us on this journey.